The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting long shadows across neatly trimmed lawns and parked cars. Officer Karen Dawson sat in her patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup. She prided herself on being strict but fair, or at least that's what she told herself. To others, though, Karen had earned a reputation for being unnecessarily harsh, especially when it came to certain groups of people. But tonight seemed ordinary enough. Karen noticed a sleek black luxury sedan driving slowly down the street. Its polished exterior gleamed under the dimming light of the day. Something about the car caught her attention, not because it was speeding or behaving erratically, but because it looked out of place in this modest neighborhood. Probably showing off, she muttered under her breath as she started her engine and flicked on her sirens. The driver pulled over smoothly, parking along the curb without hesitation. Inside the car was Marcus Thompson, a man whose calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Karen's growing irritation. He adjusted his rearview mirror and glanced back at the flashing red and blue lights behind him. A broken taillight. Really? He thought to himself. Still, he knew better than to argue. He rolled down his window, resting one hand casually on the steering wheel while keeping the other visible on his lap. A habit born out of years of experience dealing with situations like this. Karen stepped out of her cruiser, her boots clicking against the pavement. She adjusted her belt, making sure her badge was prominently displayed before walking toward the car. Her eyes narrowed as she approached. There was something about the way Marcus carried himself, his posture relaxed yet confident, that made her uneasy. It wasn't fear. It was more like annoyance. Why did he have to look so composed? License and registration, she demanded, her voice sharp and clipped. Marcus nodded politely. Of course, officer. He reached into his glove compartment, moving deliberately to avoid alarming her. But Karen didn't see politeness or cooperation. All she saw was a black man in an expensive car, a combination that triggered something deep inside her. Her mind raced with assumptions. Stolen vehicle, drugs hidden somewhere, arrogance. None of these thoughts were based on facts, but they fueled her actions all the same. She leaned closer to the window, peering into the car. The interior smelled faintly of leather and cologne, a stark contrast to the worn seats of her own patrol car. For a moment, she felt a pang of envy, though she quickly dismissed it. Instead, she focused on how Marcus hadn't said much beyond the necessary words. Was he mocking her? Defying her silently? Her grip tightened around her flashlight as frustration bubbled beneath the surface. Unbeknownst to Karen, Marcus wasn't thinking about her at all. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the past week. He'd just returned from a meeting with local leaders where they discussed ways to improve community relations with law enforcement. He thought about the young kids he mentored, the families he helped through his nonprofit organization. This stop felt inconvenient, yes, but not worth losing his temper over. But Karen wasn't interested in understanding any of that. To her, this was a chance to assert authority, to remind someone of their place. And as she watched Marcus move slowly to retrieve his documents, her patience snapped. What happened next would change both their lives forever, and shine a spotlight on issues far bigger than either of them could imagine. Karen's patience was already wearing thin, but when Marcus took a moment longer than she expected to find his registration, something inside her snapped. To her, every second that ticked by felt like defiance, a challenge to her authority. Her jaw tightened, and her fingers clenched around the flashlight in her hand. She didn't care that Marcus had been calm and cooperative up until now. All she could focus on was the narrative playing out in her mind. This man, sitting in his expensive car, was disrespecting her. "Why are you taking so long?" she barked, her voice rising sharply. "Hurry up." Marcus glanced at her briefly, his expression neutral. He wasn't trying to provoke her. He simply needed a few more seconds to locate the document. But Karen wasn't interested in explanations. In her eyes, any delay was an act of rebellion, and rebellion needed to be crushed immediately. Without warning, she reached for the car door handle, and yanked it open with such force that it startled Marcus. Before he could even process what was happening, Karen grabbed his arm roughly, pulling him halfway out of the car. The movement was sudden and aggressive, catching Marcus completely off guard. His heart raced as adrenaline surged through his body. What was going on? Why was she escalating things so quickly? And then it happened. In one swift, brutal motion, Karen drew back her fist and punched Marcus squarely in the face. The impact was shocking, not just because it came without provocation, but because of its sheer violence. Marcus stumbled backward, his head snapping to the side as pain exploded across his cheekbone. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The sound of his breath catching, the dull thud of flesh meeting flesh, it all echoed in the stillness of the evening. Karen stood there, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling as if she'd just run a marathon. Her knuckles stung from the punch, but she barely noticed. All she could think about was how good it felt to assert control, to show this man who was boss. But as Marcus slowly turned his face back toward her, blood trickling from a small cut near his eyebrow, something shifted. He looked at her, not with anger or fear, but with a quiet dignity that unnerved her. There was no yelling, no retaliation, just a steady gaze that seemed to pierce right through her bravado. It was as if he saw straight into her soul, past the uniform and the badge, to the insecurities and biases driving her actions. And for the first time since the encounter began, Karen felt a flicker of doubt. But the damage was done. Marcus sat there, dazed and bleeding, his mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here, not now. He had followed every rule, done everything by the book, yet none of that mattered. None of it stopped Karen from lashing out in a way that defied logic and reason. As the initial shock wore off, Marcus became acutely aware of his surroundings. The quiet neighborhood that had seemed so peaceful just moments ago now felt eerily silent, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, breaking the tension momentarily. But the reality of the situation remained. He had been assaulted by a police officer, someone who was supposed to protect him. Despite the pain throbbing in his face, Marcus forced himself to stay composed. He knew losing his temper wouldn't help. Instead, he focused on staying present, reminding himself that this moment, however horrifying, would pass. Little did he know, the repercussions of Karen's actions were only beginning to unfold, and they would ripple far beyond the two of them. What neither of them realized yet was that this single act of unchecked aggression would spark a chain reaction neither could have anticipated. For Marcus, it would become a turning point in his life, one that would thrust him into the spotlight and ignite a national conversation. For Karen, it would mark the beginning of the end, unraveling not just her career, but also exposing the deep-seated prejudices that had driven her behavior. As Marcus sat there, blood trickling down his face, Karen leaned in closer, her chest still heaving from the adrenaline rush of her unprovoked attack. Her mind was racing, trying to justify what she had just done. She told herself that she had been in control, that this man needed to be taught a lesson. But deep down, a flicker of unease began to creep in. Something about the way Marcus looked at her, calm, composed, almost pitying, made her stomach churn. Her eyes darted around the car, searching for something, anything, to reinforce her narrative. That's when she saw it, a silver ID badge hanging from the rearview mirror. It wasn't just any badge. It bore the insignia of the governor's office. Karen froze, her breath catching in her throat. She blinked once, twice, as if hoping the image would disappear. But it didn't. The badge glinted mockingly under the dim streetlight, forcing her to confront the gravity of her mistake. Her mind scrambled to piece together who Marcus really was. The governor's office. This wasn't some random guy driving an expensive car. This was someone important, someone with connections, someone who could make her life hell if he wanted to. Panic bubbled up inside her, replacing the earlier bravado with a cold, sinking dread. Karen took a step back instinctively, her grip on Marcus's arm loosening. For the first time in years, she felt vulnerable. All the power she thought she held over this situation slipped through her fingers like sand. Who was this man? What kind of trouble had she just brought upon herself? Marcus noticed the shift immediately. One moment, Karen had been towering over him, radiating aggression. The next, she seemed smaller, unsure. He followed her gaze and realized what had caught her attention. A bitter irony washed over him. If not for that badge, a symbol of privilege and influence, he might have been treated even worse. Would she have stopped at one punch, or would things have escalated further? The silence between them stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Karen opened her mouth to say something but quickly closed it again. Words failed her. Apologizing felt impossible. Doubling down seemed equally foolish. Instead, she stood there awkwardly, her usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. For Marcus, the moment was surreal. Here was a woman who moments ago had assaulted him without provocation, now reduced to trembling insecurity because of a piece of metal hanging from his mirror. It spoke volumes about the system they both existed within. A system where worth was often measured by titles and affiliations rather than humanity. Slowly, Marcus reached up to wipe the blood from his face. His movements were deliberate, calculated. He didn't want to give Karen the satisfaction of seeing him rattled, or worse, defeated. "Do you know who I am?" he asked finally, his voice steady despite the pain throbbing in his cheek. Karen hesitated, her lips parting slightly as if to respond. But no words came out. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, her face pale. "I'm Marcus Thompson," he continued, his tone calm yet firm. "I work closely with the governor's office on community initiatives. You might have heard of me." If possible, Karen turned even paler. Of course she'd heard of him. Everyone had. Just last month, Marcus had been featured in national news outlets for his groundbreaking work addressing racial inequality. His name was synonymous with progress and justice, and here she was, standing over him, her knuckles bruised from punching him in the face. The weight of her actions crashed down on her all at once. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop gone wrong. This was a public relations nightmare waiting to explode. Every instinct screamed at her to fix this, to apologize, to explain, to somehow undo what she'd done. But it was too late. The damage was done, and there was no going back. As the reality of the situation settled in, Karen's mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Would Marcus press charges? Would this incident go viral? Would her career, and possibly her freedom, be taken away from her? For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to truly fear consequences. Meanwhile, Marcus watched her silently, letting the moment sink in. He didn't need to say anything more. The look in his eyes said it all. She had made a grave mistake, and now she would have to live with it. Word of the incident spread like wildfire. Within hours, the quiet suburban neighborhood where Marcus had been pulled over became a hotbed of activity. Bystanders who had witnessed Karen's violent outburst couldn't believe what they'd seen. Some stood frozen in shock, while others quickly pulled out their phones to record the aftermath. The footage wasn't perfect, shaky and grainy in places, but it captured enough to tell the story. A police officer punching an unarmed man without warning, leaving him bleeding on the pavement. By morning, the video was everywhere. Social media platforms lit up with posts sharing the clip, accompanied by hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #NoMorePoliceBrutality. People were outraged. How could this happen? Why did it keep happening? Comment sections overflowed with anger, frustration, and calls for accountability. Strangers thousands of miles away weighed in, demanding answers. Local news outlets picked up the story, airing segments that painted a stark picture of the events. By noon, Marcus's name was trending nationwide. But Marcus wasn't just another victim of police misconduct. He was someone people knew, respected, and admired. His recent feature on national television, highlighting his work against racial injustice, gave the story extra weight. Viewers connected the dots. Here was a man fighting for equality, only to be brutalized by the very system he sought to reform. It was a narrative too powerful to ignore. Protests began almost immediately. Activists organized rallies outside the police department, holding signs that read "Enough is enough" and "Hold cops accountable." The crowd grew larger with each passing hour, drawing in not only locals but also supporters from neighboring towns. Some protesters chanted Marcus's name, turning it into a rallying cry. Others shared personal stories of similar encounters with law enforcement, their voices trembling with emotion. Amid the chaos, Marcus remained remarkably composed. Despite the swelling bruise on his face and the lingering pain from Karen's punch, he refused to let the incident break him. Instead, he channeled his energy into action. With the help of his attorney, he filed a formal complaint against Karen, detailing every moment of the encounter. He included the witness videos as evidence, ensuring there was no room for doubt about what had transpired. The pressure mounted on the police department. Phone lines buzzed nonstop with calls from concerned citizens demanding justice. Emails flooded inboxes, criticizing the lack of oversight and calling for immediate reforms. Even local politicians weighed in, issuing statements condemning the violence and urging transparency. The chief of police found himself at the center of a storm, fielding questions from reporters and scrambling to contain the growing scandal. Behind closed doors, tensions simmered among officers. Some defended Karen, claiming she was simply doing her job and that the situation had spiraled out of control. Others quietly expressed relief that the truth had come to light, admitting privately that Karen had a history of questionable behavior. Whispers circulated about past complaints against her, allegations of bias and aggression that had never been properly addressed. Meanwhile, Karen retreated into herself. Once confident and assertive, she now avoided eye contact with colleagues, her usual swagger replaced by visible anxiety. She knew the tide was turning against her. Every news update, every protest chant, every hashtag felt like a direct attack on her character. Friends and family urged her to stay calm, but the weight of public scrutiny was crushing. Sleep eluded her. When she did manage to close her eyes, images of Marcus's bloody face haunted her dreams. As days passed, the movement gained momentum. Schools held discussions about systemic racism and policing. Community leaders called emergency meetings to brainstorm solutions. Even businesses joined the conversation, pledging donations to organizations focused on criminal justice reform. What started as a single act of violence had ignited something far greater, a collective demand for change. For Marcus, the overwhelming support was both humbling and empowering. He realized that his experience, painful as it was, had struck a chord with countless others who had longed for justice. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of authority. And though the road ahead promised to be difficult, Marcus vowed to see it through. After all, if not now, when? If not him, who? The pressure on the police department became unbearable. The chief of police, a grizzled man named Robert Hargrove, knew he couldn't sweep this under the rug, not with the entire city watching. He called an emergency meeting with his senior staff, pacing back and forth in his office as he laid out the situation. "This isn't just about Karen anymore," he said, his voice low but urgent. "This is about us, our reputation, our integrity. If we don't handle this right, we're done." An internal investigation was launched almost immediately. On paper, it sounded thorough. Interviews with witnesses, reviews of body camera footage, though Karen's had mysteriously malfunctioned that night, and examinations of past complaints against her. But skepticism lingered in the air. Many in the community, and even some within the department, knew how these investigations often played out. Officers closed ranks, protecting their own, while those in power looked for ways to soften the blow. Justice rarely came swiftly or fairly. Karen, meanwhile, was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. It was supposed to be a neutral move. But to the public, it felt like a slap on the wrist. Protesters gathered outside her home, holding signs that read "Accountability now" and "No badges for bullies." Reporters camped out near her driveway, shoving microphones toward her whenever she dared to step outside. She avoided them all, retreating further into isolation. Her once sturdy confidence crumbled under the weight of public disdain. But then, something unexpected happened. During the investigation, evidence surfaced that no one saw coming, or perhaps no one wanted to see. A tech analyst assigned to review Karen's digital records stumbled upon a series of text messages exchanged between her and several fellow officers. The content was damning. Racist slurs peppered the conversations, along with jokes mocking minority communities. In one particularly incriminating message, Karen referred to Marcus's neighborhood as their territory, implying it didn't belong to them. When the texts were leaked to the media, a whistleblower, some claimed, the outrage reached new heights. People who had initially been willing to give Karen the benefit of the doubt now turned their backs completely. Even some of her staunchest defenders inside the department began distancing themselves. How could they justify standing by someone whose hatred was so blatant? City council members, already under fire for failing to address systemic issues within the police force, held an emergency session. They demanded answers and action. One councilwoman, a fiery advocate for reform, stood up during the meeting and addressed the room with unflinching resolve. "This is not an isolated incident," she declared. "It's a symptom of a much larger disease. If we don't root it out now, we'll lose the trust of our citizens forever." Her words struck a nerve. Funding for the police department suddenly hung in the balance. Council members threatened budget cuts unless sweeping changes were implemented. Mandatory de-escalation training, stricter accountability measures, and independent oversight boards were proposed, and met with resistance from within the department. Officers argued that such reforms would tie their hands, making it harder to do their jobs effectively. But the public wasn't interested in excuses anymore. They wanted results. As the investigation dragged on, tensions simmered both inside and outside the department. Some officers quietly supported Marcus, admitting that Karen's behavior had always made them uncomfortable. Others resented what they saw as undue attention being placed on one bad apple, while ignoring the good work most cops did every day. The division grew palpable, creating fractures in a system already teetering on the edge of collapse. For Marcus, the investigation offered little comfort. He attended meetings with investigators, answering questions calmly despite the memories it dredged up. Each retelling of the story reopened old wounds, but he persevered, knowing the importance of seeing it through. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that justice might still elude him, that the system designed to protect people like him would ultimately shield people like Karen instead. Yet, even amid the uncertainty, hope flickered. The sheer magnitude of public support reminded Marcus that he wasn't alone. This fight wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who believed in fairness and equality. And though the road ahead promised to be long and difficult, Marcus clung to the belief that change was possible. After all, history had shown time and again that when enough voices rose together, even the strongest walls could crumble. The day of the press conference arrived, and the energy in the room was electric. Reporters packed into the small auditorium, their cameras flashing like strobe lights as they jockeyed for the best position. Outside, a crowd of supporters held signs bearing Marcus's name, chanting slogans that echoed through the streets. Inside, Marcus stood backstage with his attorney, taking slow, deliberate breaths to steady himself. This moment wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever felt silenced or dismissed by those in power. When Marcus finally stepped onto the podium, the room fell silent. All eyes were on him, not just because of the swelling bruise on his face, but because of the quiet strength he exuded. He wore a crisp suit, his posture upright and dignified. For a brief moment, he looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, others strangers, and nodded slightly, as if acknowledging their collective pain as well as their hope. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice calm yet firm. "What happened to me last week was not an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern that has gone unaddressed for far too long." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. He didn't raise his voice or resort to anger. Instead, he spoke with a clarity that demanded attention. He recounted the events of that night in vivid detail: the traffic stop, the escalating aggression, the punch that left him bleeding on the pavement. As he described each moment, large screens behind him displayed photos of his injuries and clips from the bystander videos. The footage was hard to watch, even for those who had seen it before. Gasps rippled through the audience as the brutality of Karen's actions became undeniable. But Marcus didn't stop there. He shifted the focus away from himself, turning the conversation toward the bigger picture. "This isn't just about me," he said, pausing to let the weight of his words sink in. "It's about every person who has been treated as less than human because of the color of their skin. It's about every child who grows up fearing those sworn to protect them. And it's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to continue unchecked." His voice softened as he shared stories of others who had reached out to him since the incident. A young woman recounted how she'd been handcuffed and berated during a routine stop. A father described shielding his son from officers while pleading for mercy. Each story added another layer to the narrative, painting a portrait of a broken system that needed urgent repair. As Marcus wrapped up his speech, he called for action, not just words. "We need accountability," he said, his tone unwavering. "We need transparency. We need reforms that ensure no one else has to endure what I did, or worse." The room erupted in applause, the sound reverberating like thunder. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering, moved by Marcus's courage and conviction. The press conference quickly went viral, dominating headlines across the country. National news anchors replayed clips of Marcus's speech, praising his poise and determination. Social media exploded once again, with hashtags like #StandWithMarcus trending worldwide. Even prominent figures weighed in, including state legislators, celebrities, and civil rights leaders, amplifying the call for change. For Karen, the press conference was a nightmare. She watched it from her living room, curled up on the couch, her hands trembling as she gripped a glass of water. Every word Marcus spoke felt like a direct blow, stripping away whatever defenses she had left. By the end of it, tears streamed down her face, not of remorse, but of sheer panic. She realized there was no escaping the spotlight now. Her career, her reputation, everything she had worked for was crumbling before her eyes. Back at the auditorium, Marcus took questions from reporters, answering each one thoughtfully and honestly. When asked how he planned to move forward, he smiled faintly. "I'm going to keep fighting," he said simply, "not just for myself, but for everyone who deserves better." As the event concluded, Marcus walked off stage to a standing ovation. Supporters surrounded him, offering hugs and words of gratitude. For the first time in days, he allowed himself a small smile. The road ahead would be difficult, yes, but today he had shown the world that even in the face of injustice, resilience could spark real change. The trial against Karen Dawson became a national spectacle, drawing attention from every corner of the country. Courtrooms are typically quiet, orderly spaces, but this one buzzed with tension and anticipation. Reporters lined the benches, their notebooks at the ready, while activists filled the gallery, holding banners discreetly folded under their arms. Marcus sat stoically in the front row, flanked by his attorney and close friends. His presence alone commanded respect. He carried himself with a grace that made it clear he wasn't just another victim. He was a symbol of resilience. Karen appeared frail and nervous as she took her seat beside her defense team. Gone was the brash confidence she had displayed during the traffic stop. Now she avoided eye contact, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Her lawyer argued that the punch had been a momentary lapse brought on by stress and fear. A claim met with audible scoffs from the crowd. Witnesses were called to testify, including bystanders who had filmed the incident and officers who worked alongside Karen. Each account painted a damning picture of her actions. and her character. During cross-examination, prosecutors revealed the racist text messages uncovered during the investigation. The courtroom fell silent as excerpts were read aloud, each word landing like a hammer blow. One message stood out: "These people don't belong here." When asked about it, Karen stammered, claiming she didn't mean anything by it. But the damage was done. Even some members of the jury exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. After weeks of testimony, deliberation began. The jury spent 3 tense days debating behind closed doors before delivering their verdict: guilty of assault and misconduct. Cheers erupted outside the courthouse as news spread, supporters hugging one another and chanting Marcus's name. For many, the conviction felt like a rare win, a crack in the wall of systemic impunity. But when the sentencing phase arrived, disappointment quickly set in. Despite the overwhelming evidence and public outcry, the judge handed down what many considered a lenient punishment: 2 years of probation, mandatory anger management classes, and permanent revocation of Karen's badge. No jail time. To those who had hoped for real accountability, it felt like yet another betrayal by the system. Marcus addressed the media afterward, standing tall despite the frustration evident in his voice. "This sentence isn't justice," he said firmly. "It's a reminder that we still have so much work to do. We can't celebrate this outcome. We have to use it as fuel to push harder for change." His words resonated deeply, reigniting calls for broader reforms within law enforcement. For Karen, the fallout was swift and brutal. Stripped of her career and shunned by former colleagues, she retreated into obscurity. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with her toxic legacy. She sold her home and moved to a small town where she lived under the radar, haunted by the knowledge that her name would forever be tied to infamy. Meanwhile, the case sparked widespread debate. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at increasing police accountability, though progress remained slow and contentious. Activists organized marches, demanding more than lip service from politicians. And Marcus, he channeled his energy into creating lasting impact. He founded an organization dedicated to supporting victims of police brutality and advocating for policy changes. Through fundraisers, workshops, and partnerships with influential leaders, he built a network committed to dismantling the structures that allowed such injustices to persist. His nonprofit became a beacon of hope for countless individuals seeking justice. Though scars lingered, both visible and invisible, Marcus refused to let bitterness define him. Instead, he focused on the future, driven by the belief that even the smallest victories could pave the way for meaningful transformation. As he often reminded supporters, change doesn't happen overnight. But if we keep pushing, keep speaking up, we'll get there. And so, while Karen's downfall served as a cautionary tale, Marcus's journey inspired a movement, a testament to the power of courage, resilience, and collective action. The months following the trial marked a turning point, not just for Marcus, but for the entire community. The case had exposed deep wounds, but it also ignited a fire within people who were tired of waiting for change. For Marcus, the experience was transformative. What started as a personal tragedy became a catalyst for something much bigger, a movement rooted in hope, resilience, and action. Marcus poured his energy into his nonprofit organization, which he named Pathways to Justice. The name was deliberate, a reflection of his belief that true progress required more than outrage. It required clear, actionable steps toward healing and reform. The organization quickly gained traction, drawing support from all corners of society. Local businesses donated funds, schools invited Marcus to speak at assemblies, and volunteers signed up by the hundreds to help with initiatives ranging from mentorship programs to advocacy workshops. One of the group's first major projects was creating a hotline for victims of police misconduct. It wasn't just a place to report incidents, it was a lifeline, offering legal advice, counseling, and connections to pro bono attorneys. Within weeks, calls poured in from across the state, each story adding another layer to the growing demand for accountability. Marcus listened to every call personally, ensuring that no one felt unheard or dismissed. His compassion reminded callers that they weren't alone, and that their voices mattered. But Marcus didn't stop there. He partnered with lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at increasing transparency in law enforcement. One groundbreaking bill introduced mandatory body cameras for all officers, along with strict penalties for tampering or failing to record interactions. Another required independent oversight boards to review complaints against police, removing the conflict of interest inherent in internal investigations. These measures faced resistance, of course. Some argued they went too far, while others said they didn't go far enough. But Marcus remained steadfast, knowing compromise was part of the process. His efforts began to bear fruit. Cities nationwide took notice, adopting similar reforms inspired by Marcus's work. Activists credited him with sparking a wave of accountability that rippled through institutions long considered untouchable. Even critics begrudgingly admitted that his approach was effective, not confrontational, but constructive. Marcus proved that anger could be channeled into action, and pain could fuel purpose. For Karen, life after the trial was unrecognizable. Once proud and domineering, she now lived quietly, working odd jobs to make ends meet. Her name occasionally surfaced in news articles about police brutality, always accompanied by words like disgraced or convicted. She avoided public spaces, fearing recognition, and spent most evenings alone in her small apartment, replaying the events of that fateful night in her mind. Some might have called it karma. Others saw it as a cautionary tale about unchecked bias and abuse of power. Either way, her downfall served as a stark reminder of the consequences of prejudice. Back in the community, Marcus's influence continued to grow. Schools renamed awards in his honor, and local leaders sought his guidance on policy decisions. Yet despite his newfound prominence, he remained humble, often reminding supporters that the fight was far from over. "We've made progress," he'd say during speeches, "but progress isn't perfection. We can't afford to become complacent." Perhaps the most profound impact of Marcus's journey was how it inspired ordinary people to take extraordinary actions. A teenager who attended one of his workshops started a petition demanding better training for school resource officers. A retired teacher began volunteering with Pathways to Justice, using her skills to organize fundraising events. Families affected by similar injustices found solace in sharing their stories, realizing they weren't isolated cases, but part of a larger narrative demanding change. As time passed, Marcus reflected on the scars he carried, both visible and invisible. The bruise on his face had faded, but the memory of that night lingered, a constant reminder of why his work mattered. Still, he refused to let bitterness define him. Instead, he focused on the future, driven by the belief that even the smallest victories could pave the way for meaningful transformation. In the end, Marcus's legacy wasn't just about holding one officer accountable. It was about challenging a system that had failed so many for so long. He showed the world that courage doesn't mean being fearless. It means standing up despite fear. And though the road ahead promised to be long and difficult, Marcus knew that together, step by step, real justice was possible. After all, every pathway begins with a single step, and Marcus Thompson had already taken his.